Welcome to the Book Review channel, where each book page opens up a world of knowledge and soul, where we collectively seek and discover the true values of life and become better versions of ourselves. Today we will explore the work titled The Ego and the ID by Sigmund Freud. This is not only a revolutionary work in the field of psychology but also a profound journey into the nature of humans. Through this, Freud leads us into the world of the mind, where the three main components, the ID, the ego, and the superego interact, struggle, and adjust each other to shape our actions and emotions. In this video, the Book Review channel will not just explain the content of the book but also provide you with practical examples from life, helping you understand better how these psychological concepts operate within your own life. Let's explore the three main components together. Component 1, as the author names it, is the ID, the source of human vitality. Freud describes the ID as the most primitive and wild part of our mind. Governed by the pleasure principle, the ID seeks to satisfy the most basic desires of humans, the needs for survival such as food, sex, comfort. The distinctive thing about the ID is that it has no reasoning or awareness of consequences, it has only one aim, and that is immediate satisfaction. A simple example of the ID's presence can be seen in children. When they are hungry, they cry for food, regardless of the surrounding circumstances or whether it is appropriate to demand at that time. A child cannot wait, nor do they care about the manner in which their needs will be met. In the child's mind, the ID is controlling all actions. In the daily life of adults, the ID continues to exist, but now it is expressed through powerful desires that we are not always able to control. A clear example is when we feel hungry during work, we might feel a strong urge to leave the desk to find food. At this point, the impulse of the ID is clearly manifesting. However, in adults, the ego has developed to help control and regulate these needs, which will be discussed later. The ID is also the source of sexual impulses, a factor to which Freud paid much attention. According to Freud, sexual instinct is an important part of the survival instinct, and it is an essential part of the ID. A real-world example of the ID's influence in this area can be seen when we feel strongly attracted to someone without being able to explain why. The ID is seeking to satisfy instinctual desires, and without the regulation of the ego, these feelings can lead to uncontrollable behaviors. Component 2 is called the ego, the balancer between reality and the ID. Freud describes the ego as the rational part of humans, playing the role of adjusting between the insatiable demands of the ID and the stringent rules of the superego. The ego operates based on the reality principle, which means it seeks to fulfill the ID's needs but must do so within the limits accepted by society and ethics. A typical example of how the ego functions can be observed in daily situations, like when we feel hungry. Instead of immediately getting up and finding anything edible as the ID would do, the ego intervenes to determine whether it is appropriate to eat at that moment. If you are in a meeting, the ego will try to delay the ID's desire until the meeting concludes and you can eat reasonably. The ego is thus a tool of regulation, helping us act intelligently and wisely in every situation. The ego not only deals with the ID but also has to manage stress coming from the superego. For instance, if you feel pressure from society or family to succeed in your career, you might be torn between the desire to succeed as the superego demands and personal desires like spending time for yourself or family as the ID demands. In this scenario, the ego must find a way to harmonize these elements, allowing you to achieve goals without neglecting personal needs. An interesting example in literature can be found in the character Hamlet by Shakespeare. Hamlet is torn between the desire for revenge, which the ego represents, and the moral rules against murder which the superego represents. Hamlet cannot decide quickly and his ego becomes overwhelmed by pressure from both sides, leading to impotence and creating a crisis in thought and action. The second component is what the author calls the superego, the voice of conscience. The superego is the part that represents our conscience and morality, formed from societal, familial, and cultural values. It pushes us towards perfection and ethics, but sometimes it can be too strict. A practical example of the superego's influence can be seen in people who always feel guilty or anxious about not meeting their own or societal expectations. For instance, a student might feel enormous pressure from the superego to achieve high grades and success in studies, even though they might actually want to rest or pursue personal interests. The superego acts like a voice of conscience, but if not regulated, it can make people stressed and feel unnecessary pressure. In some cases, the superego can create a sense of guilt when we don't live up to societal standards. For instance, an adult might feel guilty for not spending enough time with their family, even when they have tried their best. The superego will continually remind them of the rules and expectations, and if not adjusted, it can become a factor that causes anxiety and stress. And so, in life, we always see the unconscious struggle between the id, the ego, and the superego. A clear example of this struggle is when we feel torn between desire and responsibility. You might want to quit the current job to pursue a passion, but fear that this would be financially unstable or not accepted by society, superego. Meanwhile, the id only cares about immediate satisfaction without considering long-term consequences. The ego has to play the role of regulator, finding a reasonable solution and balancing the demands of the id and the conscience of the superego. In a specific situation, if the ego is too weak and cannot control the conflict between the id and the superego, a person can fall into a crisis. People with a too strong id may become impulsive, unable to control behavior, leading to irrational decisions, such as excessive spending or engaging in unhealthy relationships. Conversely, if the superego is too strong, one will always feel guilty and anxious, imposing too much pressure on oneself. Freud describes this struggle as an unavoidable part of human life. However, if we can learn how to recognize and regulate between the id, the ego, and the superego, we can find balance, harmony in life, and self-healing. Freud has created an extremely complex yet meaningful system of human mind analysis. Through the book The Ego and the id, Freud helps us delve deep into the nature of the unconscious mind and realize that to live a peaceful and harmonious life, we need to understand the internal conflicts. The way we balance between instinctual needs, the control of reason, and societal expectations will shape who we are. Understanding the ego is the key that helps us free ourselves from the constraints of inner conflicts and live a freer, happier life. So how do we create balance between the id, the ego, and the superego in practical life? Freud emphasizes that the id, the ego, and the superego do not exist separately but always interact and influence each other. Hence, to achieve inner harmony, we need to understand how these three components operate, thereby finding the right balance. For example, in a stressful working environment, you might face a contradiction between the desire to achieve high achievements, superego, and the urge to rest and enjoy, id. If you only chase the perfect desire of the superego without paying attention to personal needs, you might fall into exhaustion and stress. Conversely, if you only live according to the id, you might easily lose motivation, fail to meet work demands, leading to long-term negative consequences. In such a case, the ego plays the role of the regulator. You can use the ego to balance between working hard and spending time for yourself. You might choose to create a reasonable work schedule, taking time off on weekends or after stressful projects. By listening to both the needs of the id and the superego, the ego helps you adjust life reasonably and sustainably. One of Freud's important emphases in the ego and the id is the role of the unconscious in shaping our behavior and emotions. The unconscious holds memories, emotions, and impulses that we cannot consciously realize but have a profound impact on our daily lives. Freud suggests that many inner conflicts and psychological issues arise from repressed emotions in the unconscious. To achieve healing, we need to explore and face the deepest parts of our minds. For instance, a person might experience anxiety or stress without being able to identify the cause. Freud would explain this through the lens of the unconscious. Impulses or painful memories from the past have been repressed beneath the conscious surface, and now they erupt out as anxiety. For example, someone might feel pressured or scared when facing personal relationships without knowing why. This can result from emotional hurts or feelings of abandonment during childhood. Freud suggests that exploring and understanding the unconscious can help us release repressed emotions and achieve psychological healing. One way to do this is through methods like psychoanalysis or psychodynamic therapy. When we dare to confront painful memories and hidden conflicts, we can reduce the stress and insecurity they cause in our present lives. For instance, someone might discover that unjustified anger towards a current partner actually stems from past wounds when they were young. Upon realizing this, the ego will find ways to adjust and reconcile unconscious emotions with present consciousness, helping one to understand and gain better control over their feelings. This way, they can enhance their current relationships and reduce stress in life. What psychological issues might we face when we cannot balance the id, the ego, and the superego? Freud thinks that losing balance between the id, the ego, and the superego is the source of many psychological issues. When one of these three factors dominates excessively, we will encounter behavioral and cognitive disorders. When the id is too strong, when the id dominates, people become impulsive and lack control. A typical example is people who are addicted, unable to control their desires for alcohol, drugs, or other pleasures. In this case, a weak ego cannot control the id, leading to self-destructive behaviors without considering the consequences. When the superego is too strong, when the superego dominates, people might become too harsh on themselves, leading to constant guilt and anxiety. These people often live under the pressure of too high standards they set for themselves or due to family and societal influences. This can lead to anxiety disorders, depression, or low self-esteem problems. When the ego is weak, if the ego is not strong enough to balance between the id and the superego, we can easily fall into a state of crisis. A person with a weak ego might easily be swayed by the impulses of the id or feel continuous pressure from the superego. They may experience periods of depression, anxiety, or mental disorders when they cannot handle internal conflicts. For instance, a workaholic might be dominated by a too strong superego. They feel the need to work incessantly to meet personal and societal expectations. This can lead to exhaustion, health decline, and damaged personal relationships. The ego in this case needs to be strengthened to help the person find a balance between the need to work and the need to rest. And what should we do to apply the id and the ego in personal life to be more successful? That is, when we recognize clearly the existence of the id, the ego, and the superego in our own mind, we can begin to adjust behavior and emotions to achieve balance and harmony. A crucial lesson from the id and the ego is the ability of self-awareness. When we clearly recognize the impulses of the id, the rules of the superego, and how the ego harmonizes between them, we can manage our life more consciously. We can control instinctual desires, but at the same time, we also do not let the superego impose overly strict standards on ourselves. For example, in stressful situations, asking yourself, is this the action of the id, the superego, or the ego? This question can help you gain a clearer view of your emotions and behavior. If you realize that the id is controlling you, you can find ways to curb short-term desires to achieve long-term benefits. If the superego is seen as too strict, you can learn to forgive yourself and reduce pressure. Freud's book also encourages us to explore our own unconscious. Understanding repressed conflicts, memories, and emotions can help us release ourselves from mental constraints and live a freer and happier life. By understanding the three components of the id, the ego, and the superego, we can identify and harmonize inner conflicts to live a more balanced and peaceful life. Freud not only provides us with tools to understand the unconscious mind better but also helps us explore ourselves more deeply. By recognizing and adjusting the components of our mind, we can begin the healing journey, live a freer life, and achieve harmony with ourselves by accepting and harmonizing mind factors. One of the deepest messages Freud conveys through the ID and the ego is the necessity of accepting every part of our mind, whether it is the primal instinct or ethical conscience. We should not view the ID, the ego, and the superego as absolutely good or bad. Instead, they are indispensable parts of human psychology that help us survive and develop. Freud emphasizes that the ID is not something that needs to be completely eliminated. Although the ID represents instinctual desires that might not align with societal or ethical norms, it is also a source of life energy and creativity. For example, in art or other creative activities, the ID can become a powerful motivation to push us beyond the limits of reality and create unique works, emotions elated. Artists, writers, or scientists are often driven by deep impulses from the ID, helping them dare to think and do things differently. Conversely, the superego is not always right. It can bring about excessive guilt or cause anxiety if we do not live according to the perfect standards it imposes. In fact, some people always feel insecure because they always want to achieve perfection, never satisfied with themselves despite making great efforts. In this case, the ego needs to intervene to help them reduce the strictness of the superego and learn to forgive themselves and accept personal limitations. In practical terms, a mother might feel guilty for not spending enough time with her child, although she actually does everything possible. Her superego always sets high expectations, demanding perfection in her role as a mother. However, the ego will help her realize that no one is perfect, and what she does best within her ability is enough. Accepting imperfection is the first step to achieving inner balance. The psychological concepts Freud introduces can be widely applied in various fields of modern life. They are not only tools for psychologists to understand human behavior better but also methods for each of us to self-reflect and improve ourselves. In work, an employee might feel pressured to meet standards set by superiors or society, superego, while their ID wants to seek comfort and freedom. The ego at this time will play a regulatory role, helping them find a way to balance between completing work and rewarding themselves with a vacation to regenerate energy. In relationships, conflicts between the ID, the ego, and the superego often appear in personal relations. For instance, in a romantic relationship, the ID might push you to want intimacy and immediate emotional satisfaction, while the superego demands adherence to certain social or moral norms. The ego will help you find ways to build a sustainable relationship based on understanding and respect, rather than merely following short-term desires or excessively strict rules. In personal development, understanding the relationship between the ID, the ego, and the superego can help us develop self-awareness skills, thereby improving stress management abilities and making wiser decisions. For example, when you face a difficult situation, instead of merely reacting according to the ID or trying to adhere to unrealistic expectations, you can pause to evaluate the situation and find a reasonable solution, based on a balance between emotion and reason. Though more than a century has passed since Freud introduced the concepts of the ID, the ego, and the superego, they continue to have significant influence in many areas of psychology and modern life. Many psychologists have developed new theories based on Freud's foundation, and psychoanalytic methods are still widely used in psychological therapy. One notable aspect is how modern psychology has combined Freud's findings with neuroscientific research, particularly in understanding better the operations of the brain and the nervous system. Recent studies on the brain and human behavior have reinforced some of Freud's theories about the unconscious, showing that many of our actions truly originate from psychological processes that we do not consciously recognize. Additionally, Freud's concept of internal conflict has also been applied in many fields outside psychology, including philosophy, cultural studies, and even art. Struggles between desire, reason, and ethics remain crucial topics in literature, cinema, and music, reflecting deeply the complex relationship between humans and their own selves. The ID and the Ego is not only a foundational work in psychology but also a book that can change the way we view ourselves and the world around us. Freud opened the door to a deeper understanding of internal conflicts and how we can adjust them to achieve balance and happiness. Freud's work reminds us that the struggle between the ID, the ego, and the superego is natural and unavoidable. Instead of trying to eliminate or suppress a part of the mind, we need to learn how to harmonize them to live a balanced life. Understanding the unconscious and internal conflicts is the key to healing, growing, and finding harmony with oneself. Through the work The ID and the Ego by the author Freud, we may derive a powerful philosophy of living, live consciously, harmonize between instinctual desires and ethical aspirations, and continuously explore yourself through the deeper layers of the mind. Only when we understand and accept ourselves completely, both strengths and weaknesses, both the ID and reason, can we truly master our lives and live with inner peace. This is a good book review. If you like our program, please like and follow. Press the bell to not miss any financial stories or investment tips or self-healing methods or journeys of inner understanding, creating joy. See you in the next program. Thank you for listening.